not want to throw it in the face. That may not be the best way to approach somebody, but you need to look for opportunities to teach the truth, because that's the most important thing for people. Another thing is that we need to not let rejection from somebody affect the way we view a group of people. For instance, um, like if you are talking to somebody who's older and they reject you, then you just say, well, I'm not going to older people because they're not going to listen. Yeah, yeah. It doesn't. If we start lumping people together and just assume that it's no use talking to people because somebody who fits into a demographic or a group rejected it, uh, then we'll limit ourselves greatly on who we're going to talk to and who we're going to try to teach. So I think we need to not allow somebody's background or whatever it is to that we didn't succeed in reaching, then make it so that we don't try to reach somebody of that same background or of that same demographic or whatever it is. Right. Yeah. Yep. I think that's true. I think we do that, but we also need to be aware that sometimes there may be something outside of our comfort zone that we need to try. Um, you know, and I wouldn't, and I'm a big proponent of using your strengths. So I'm not saying that if you're not good at going and talking to somebody you don't know, that's what you should do all the time. That you should go out and talk to people you don't know. Um, you should try to find what your strengths are and use that. But if your strength, like we were talking about earlier, if your strength isn't in talking to people, maybe you go along with somebody, to talk to people, somebody who is, or something like that. You might be able to try that. Um, but the main thing we need to do is think about how can we reach people, and really make a concerted effort to do that. Stay on mission. How do we help people? How do we teach people? Um, all right, Jesus. Let's go down. Where was this? Luke 9. Okay, let's go to verse 10. And when the apostles returned, they gave an account to him of all that they had done, and taking them with him, he withdrew by himself to a city called Bethsaida. So Jesus has the apostles talk about what they had done and give an account of it. How did it work? Should we do that today? Talk about what we're doing with each other? You know, um, what would the benefits be of doing that? To help encourage each other? Because for one thing, if somebody has a success, that's a good thing, right? That can be an encouragement to others. Hey, I talked to somebody and we're studying or whatever. That can be an encouragement. Um, Also, for those who have rejected, talking to each other can help be helpful, right? Just to get past that, to overcome that. Um, Also, we can help each other learn new ways, like what we were talking about. You might have a strength in doing something one way, but in talking to others, we might learn something that we can do differently, or something we can talk to people about. And also, I think it brings a closeness, a feeling of unity whenever we talk with each other. So I think it is good to talk to each other about what we're doing and how that's going. Our mission as Christians means that we should always have our eyes open for opportunities to both help people and to share our faith with them. Uh, let's go to 1 Peter 3:15 real quick. And we'll talk about this passage in the sermon too today. But actually, we'll drop back to 14. But even if you should suffer for the sake of righteousness, you are blessed, and do not fear their intimidation, and do not be troubled, but sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence, and keep a good conscience, so that in the things in which you are slandered, those who revile your good behavior in Christ may be put to shame. So Peter tells us to always be ready to give an answer, right? 1 Peter 3:15. Well, 15 was what I just read. It was 14 through 16. So we're always to be ready. And Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:2 to always be ready to teach the word, to preach it, in season and out of season, right? So we need to be prepared. As Christians, we should always be thinking about that, about how can we help others, how can we teach others, being prepared to give an answer if somebody asks us, if somebody sees our example and asks us about why we're doing what we're doing, we need to be ready to do that, to give an explanation for that. Yes. Right. So we need to keep our eyes open, because I think oftentimes we let those opportunities go by. All right, so let's go back to Luke now, Luke 9, and we'll pick up with verse 18. I see where we're at time-wise, so I'm not sure exactly how far we'll get through this. I expected to get through about midway through the chapter. I think there's a lot of good lessons that we can learn here. Oh, and I forgot to mention as we started, some of this material is actually from like a little study book. It's not exact because I always change things for my own thoughts, but these little books by Leon Barnes. I forget when it was written. This would have been a long time ago because this was like when I was in college, so would have been a while ago. But anyway, so some of this material is coming to some degree from those books. I meant to mention that earlier on, forgot. I'm not sure. It's just these are where I pulled a few of the questions and stuff from. So, picking up in verse 18. And it came about that while he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he questioned them, saying, "Who do the multitude say that I am?" And they answered and said, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, but others that one of the prophets of old has risen again." And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered and said, "The Christ of God." But he warned them and instructed them not to tell this to anyone, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and be raised up on the third day." And he was saying to them all, "If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life shall lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake, he is the one who will save it. For what is a man profited if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words of him, will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I say to you truthfully, there are some of those standing here who shall not taste death until they see the kingdom of God." All right. So we all have a group of people that we associate with, right? Friends, family. That's who we surround ourselves with. People at work, people at church. Uh, and a major problem that we all have, because we're people, uh, that we all have is that we tend to lose contact with what people outside of our circle are thinking, right? We see it in businesses, we see it in politics and governments, schools, and even in the church. You know, we see when we talk amongst ourselves, and if we're all of the same opinion, we tend to think everybody thinks that way, right? And I see that especially in politics. Like, you got group people on one side that think everybody thinks that way, and somebody on the other side thinks everybody thinks that way, and then whenever they find out they don't, we get a lot of conflict. So we need to realize that there are other thoughts out there than what we may be aware of, because we get kind of stuck into a one way of thinking. Now, I mean that would be extreme for us to not know what the other opinions are out there, but it can happen that we get colored that way. Our group feeds us information and attitudes, and we think it represents everything. Uh, and this can be especially the case for those who are leading in various ways. Go back to those things that we just mentioned: business, church, governments. And in those cases, the people who are leading are getting fed information, and it might be very one-sided. And what happens whenever you get one-sided information? You can make some bad decisions, right? So bad things can happen. Um, and whenever leaders in the business make a decision based on what they think is accurate, and then they turn out to be wrong. For instance, companies will put things out there to taste test or whatever, test market, and then they'll make a decision about whether they're going to go full blown. There's a famous one of those. Does anybody? I don't know if anybody's thinking along the lines I am. You guys remember Coke and the New Coke? New Coke didn't go over so well, did it? But I'm sure that they tested it, and I'm sure that they had a group that liked it. They wouldn't have just thrown it out there saying, everybody's going to like it. So, we need to really thoroughly test or think about, do we know both sides of something before we go? And Jesus here, what does he do? He goes to pray, and then in verse 18, what does he say? Who do they think I am, right? So why do you think it's important that he asks them, who do people think I am? Yeah, different people, right? So we can't teach people without knowing what they think, right? If we know their frame of reference, um, so how do you find out what they think? Ask might work, depending. Sometimes you may not have that opportunity. If it's somebody that you don't normally talk to, they're not going to. It'd be weird for you to go up and say, "Hey, what do you think?" Right? You may not have the opportunity. Sometimes you might. You might be able to go up and just say to someone. You can do questionnaires, yeah. can look on the internet, but don't believe everything you see on the internet. Uh, but there's different. But the biggest thing is ask, like Roxanne said. Try to find out. We need to ask those specifically. You need to ask people who would know. Don't ask your friend who thinks the same way you do what other people are thinking. Like, don't stay in your group. You got to go outside of your group to find out. We have to do whatever it takes to be more of what Jesus wants and to try to allow others to see Jesus in us. I think that's important, and that involves getting to know what people are thinking. So, like I said, we can only think in our frame of reference. I've become more aware of this as I've gotten older. How much we're stuck in what we think. Like as I'm trying to think of an example. Like, I grew up, we barely had computers as I was starting. Those who were before me didn't have computers at all, or phones. When you go back and watch old TV shows like Andy Griffith, they have the old phone where they call an operator and they say, "Hey," and they know the operator's name. It's like, "Hey, Susan, get me whoever," and and then my kids, I look at my kids and they've only known cell phones. So it's like, do you know what they're doing whenever they're using that phone? Like what that takes the place of? But that's our frame. So our frame of reference is different. Like, my frame of reference is different from those who are older than me, and different from those who are younger than me, as far as the way things, what technology wise, and the way the world is. And it's the same thing when you come to like, age is important in what you've been taught, because the educators have changed and how they're teaching kids, and so we have to have to know what frame of reference we're coming from. Jesus ran into this problem when he came to earth. What were the Jews expecting? Right? Yeah, we look at people as groups where Jesus actually looked down into an individual. Yeah. Hmm. And what did they think the Messiah was? An earthly king, right? Somebody who was going to lead them to greatness again. They had been in captivity for years, right? I mean, uh, there was sort of a nation of Israel back because Rome had put it back together, but um, to some degree allowed it to be a province, I guess, or well, not even a province, uh, but have some of their own government. But they still had Roman rule over them, right? As we see whenever Jesus is put on the cross, right? Who's in charge of that? Pilate, right? Pilate, who's the Roman government. So they had some of their own stuff, but they were really still under Roman rule at that point. Um, so people were looking for somebody to lead them back to greatness, and even the apostles were thinking that along the way. And they had only known of who were the greatest people that they had known from the past. Well, Elijah and John the Baptist. These were people that. So that's why they were starting to say, well, Jesus is one of them. Today when we try to teach people, we can run into the same problem. People may not understand what we're saying to mean what we mean. Like they may think something different when we say something. What do you think people think if I say baptism? If I say the word baptize, I think a lot of people out there would think just some religious ceremony, right? Like some, it's just a ceremony. It's not anything of import. Where we're really talking about when somebody is obeying the gospel, making the decision to put on Christ. Um, there's a big difference in the way you interpret that. Um, so one major problem in the church is that often even those in the church don't understand the nature uh, of the church or the mission of the church, like what we were discussing. Um, how can we teach others if we don't understand ourselves or if we don't know ourselves? It's kind of difficult to do, right? Uh, what if the 12 could not have given the right answer to Jesus? What if they couldn't have told him what people were saying? Then they wouldn't be in the know, right? They wouldn't know, that means they wouldn't have known what was going on out there. And if we don't know what's going on out there, we're going to have problems in relating to people. Jesus knew that they knew who he was, but the time was not right for him to teach them yet. So here again is something that we can learn is sometimes people aren't ready for a full onslaught or for things. The message needed to be presented at the right time. And this means that we must not try to push people too hard when we teach them, and we need to look for the right opportunity. And that's why we always have to keep that open. We don't want to, be full on in somebody's face all the time. That's just going to turn them off. But we got to look for the right opportunity for when we can present the gospel to them. All right. So once the disciples knew who Jesus was, he told them what discipleship was going to require. Like what we were talking about, the apostles thought that they were going to be alongside Jesus in his earthly kingdom here, being earthly rulers. At least that's what they thought at first. Um, and it's a lot easier to be a disciple whenever you're thinking of it as you're going to get a reward, right? Um, and we are going to get a reward as following Christ. He tells us that we're going to get a reward, but that reward doesn't necessarily come while we're here on earth, does it? And the disciples were willing to pay the cost even after they found out what that was. It just took a little bit of learning for them till they got there. All right, so we're closing in on running out of time here, and I had a little bit more dealing with this passage here, talking about 3 steps in discipleship. The first step that Jesus gives is self-denial. And what does that mean, self-denial? That we're the least important. Right, because that's what he says in verse 23. If anyone wishes to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Um, How does that relate to today? What is today's? I already got it. Uh, what is today's view of self-esteem and self-image in our society? We're number one, right? We're used to hearing about having self-actualization or self, you know, what makes you feel good, what's important to you. Jesus taught that we need to get our minds off of ourselves and onto others. Jesus taught that true happiness comes when we put others before ourselves, while today's philosophy tends to say we have to find things that make us happy before we can try to help others. So it's flipped that we need to, what's the order there? Um, and that's true to a certain extent in that I mean, obviously we can't help others if we're in a state that doesn't allow for that. But part of of realizing our own self-worth, I think, is trying to help others. So it's the order there of how we do it. Second thing, we must lose ourselves. He talks about in the world we hear of people saying that they must find themselves, and that usually is a self-centered approach. Once again, thinking about me. Uh, but Jesus says the opposite. The answer to low self-esteem is to not think so much about yourself and more about others. Put Christ first. Um, you know, the statement that's made in Scripture: one who gains a lot in this world gains nothing if he loses his soul. Right? Oh yeah, advertising is very big in that. Yep. All right, and then finally, we just have to take our stand with Jesus. We cannot be ashamed of him, and we need to just always make sure that we're on Jesus' side. And we're about out of time here, so we'll end up there. I didn't quite get that last point out the way I wanted, but that's okay. All right, thank you.